November 15, 1998, in Brooksville, a small town in Florida, Kendra Parker, a 38-year-old woman, led a seemingly perfect life with her husband, Richard Parker. Married for 15 years, they had 2 children and were the typical couple admired by the community. However, Kendra began to notice something strange about Richard's behavior. He was more distant, spent more time away from home, and took frequent business trips to Atlanta, Georgia. These trips were becoming longer and more frequent, and Kendra began to feel suspicious. At first, she tried to ignore her instincts. "I thought it was just the stress of work." Richard had always been dedicated to his job, and the long hours were part of the routine. Yet something inside her insisted there was more. As the months passed, Richard's excuses began to seem repetitive, almost rehearsed. And like any wife who has known her husband for years, she began to connect the dots. One night, while Richard was out on business, Kendra took his cell phone, something she had never done before. His heart was beating fast. His hands were sweaty with nervousness. She didn't want to be that person, but she couldn't help it. When he opened the messages, he found conversations with a woman named Jessica Collins. The messages left no doubt. Richard was leading a double life. Kendra felt the world crumble around her. Jessica lived in Atlanta, and the messages revealed that she and Richard hadn't just been together for a few months. They had a 4-year-old daughter, and were building a life Kendra could never have imagined. The shock was like a punch in the gut. But instead of confronting him immediately, Kendra decided to keep this information to herself. She needed to know more. In the weeks following the discovery, Kendra Parker felt like she was living a double life. In daylight, she maintained the appearance of a devoted wife and mother. "I continued to take care of my children, attend school meetings and family dinners, but inside, something terrible was happening." His heart was a battlefield between pain and anger. Richard's betrayal had shattered any trace of trust that existed between them, and Jessica's presence in their lives was an open wound, impossible to ignore. Every time Richard left for business trips, Kendra felt a wave of hatred and despair wash over her. She imagined the 2 of them together, living a life that was supposed to be hers, and it consumed her in a way she had never felt before. His mind refused to find peace. She began to lose sleep. Nights were spent tossing and turning in bed, wondering how Richard could have been so cruel. Eventually, Kendra's obsession became not just about Richard, but especially about Jessica. Who was that woman who had infiltrated his life? How dare she take what was his? Kendra found herself spending hours in front of the computer, researching every detail of Jessica Collins' life. She found her social media and began to follow her discreetly, looking at every photo, every comment, trying to understand how a person like Jessica had become part of her personal hell. In the photos, Jessica looked happy, radiant, with a confident smile that only fueled Kendra's hatred. How can she smile knowing she destroyed a family? Kendra thought. Jessica had something that Kendra thought she had lost forever: Richard's youth, carefreeness, and admiration. It was as if Kendra was seeing the life she wanted, but now in someone else's hands. This obsession took a more sinister form over time. Kendra began following Jessica closely. He took a trip to Atlanta just to observe his wife's routine from afar. He saw Jessica leaving the house with her daughter, going to the supermarket, living a life that Kendra only knew in the shadows. She wanted to confront her there, in the street, but she held back. It wasn't time. Not yet. Days turned into weeks, and Kendra's frustration grew along with her desire for revenge. She was not a violent person. I had never thought about hurting someone before. But now, the thought of violent justice against Jessica was the only thing that seemed to ease the pain he felt. She began to consider possibilities that would have previously been unthinkable. What if Jessica just disappeared? The revenge fantasies Kendra had in mind were no longer brief moments of loss of control. They took over his mind in a systematic way. She found herself planning, imagining how she would make it happen, how she would cover her tracks. Deep down, Kendra knew she wouldn't be able to move forward as long as Jessica was alive. This woman not only stole her husband, but she also stole her dignity, her peace of mind, her identity as a wife. One day, while Richard was on another of his business trips, Kendra decided it was time to take action. She sat in front of the bedroom mirror and looked at her own reflection. He didn't recognize the woman he saw. His eyes were dark, empty, as if all the light that had once existed in his heart had been drained away. She realized that, at some point, she had crossed a line. She was no longer just a betrayed wife. She was no longer just a woman suffering for love. She was something different now, something colder, more dangerous. It was then that she picked up the phone and made a call that would change everything. Kendra knew someone who could get her what she needed: a gun. She knew that once she had this in her hands, there would be no turning back. He felt a chill down his spine, but also a strange feeling of power. For the first time in months, she felt like she had control. If Jessica wanted to steal her life, she would pay the highest price. Over the next few days, Kendra began preparing. He bought the gun from an acquaintance without asking questions. He kept it hidden in a safe place, away from the eyes of Richard and the children. That piece of metal represented more than a tool of destruction. For Kendra, it was the key to freeing herself from the nightmare her life had become. As the plan solidified in her mind, Kendra became calmer, more in control. She knew the moment was near, and the anticipation of finally ending Jessica was the only thing keeping her going. She no longer felt fear or regret. I felt that, in a way, I was restoring order, taking justice into your own hands. When I looked at Jessica's photos now, I no longer felt those butterflies in my stomach or the urge to cry. All she felt was a calculated coldness, a need to finish this. Kendra was ready, and Jessica had no idea what was about to happen. Kendra was at her limit. The decision to act had already been made. Now all that was left was to plan the perfect moment to exact his revenge. The days leading up to his action were meticulously calculated. Kendra knew she couldn't make any mistakes. Jessica Collins needed to be eliminated, and Kendra would make sure there was no way to trace her back. She watched Jessica closely, studying her routine, mapping her habits. He knew the days when Jessica was home alone, the times when her daughter was at school, and when Jessica's boyfriend, Richard himself, was away on his business trips. The obsession Kendra developed turned her into a meticulous predator. His mind worked like a sinister puzzle, assembling each piece with precision. She needed a plan that looked like an accident, something Jessica never saw coming. The idea for the trap began to take shape when Kendra noticed that Jessica always went to the same park every Sunday morning to walk. It was a relatively isolated place, and the way back home was along a lightly traveled road, surrounded by dense trees and shadows. It was the perfect place, the place where it would all end. On that Sunday morning, the day was cloudy. A heavy atmosphere hung in the air, as if the universe knew what was about to happen. Kendra left the house early, wearing a blonde wig and sunglasses to ensure she wasn't recognized. The disguise was simple but effective. She drove to a spot near the park and parked on a side street, away from prying eyes. The gun was stored in the glove compartment, cold and deadly, waiting for the right moment. Jessica, as predicted, was alone that morning. She walked calmly along the park trails, as she did every Sunday, without realizing that she was being watched. Kendra's plan was simple: lure Jessica to a secluded location, confront her, and then end her life. The park, with its winding paths and deserted areas, offered several opportunities for this. Kendra waited patiently until Jessica finished her walk and started heading home. She drove slowly, keeping a safe distance, following Jessica as she walked through the empty streets. The road leading to Jessica's house was surrounded by dense trees, making it the perfect place for an ambush. Kendra knew there was a specific section, just around a bend, where traffic was almost non-existent. It would be there. That was where it would all end. But Jessica's words had no effect. Kendra was already too far gone to be brought back. The sound of the trigger being pulled echoed across the silent road, followed by the sharp fire of the gun. Jessica fell to the ground, lifeless. Blood stained the asphalt, mixing with the fallen leaves around, creating a macabre and lonely scene. Kendra stood there for a moment, looking at Jessica's still body. I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. The deed was done, but the weight of what he had done had not yet fully revealed itself. Kendra knew she couldn't stay there for long. She put the gun back in her jacket, took a deep breath, and walked calmly back to her car. His heart was pounding, but his mind was cold, calculating. She drove away from the scene, disappearing into the deserted city streets. She knew that eventually someone would find the body. I knew that an investigation would be opened, and that Richard would be drawn into the chaos. But none of that mattered anymore. What Kendra wanted, she had gotten. Jessica was dead. As the sun began to set, the silence of the isolated road was broken by the sound of a police car's siren. Jessica Collins' body had been found by a passing motorist, and the scene was quickly cordoned off. The field of evidence was in the process of being collected as investigators and experts examined the crime scene. News of Jessica's death quickly spread throughout the small community of Atlanta, and shock took over everyone. Richard Parker was in a client's office when he received the call that would change his life forever. The police officer on the other end of the line had a deep, formal voice, informing him that his wife, Kendra, was involved in an extremely serious situation. Richard felt a chill run down his spine, panic and confusion mixing in his chest. He tried to get more details, but the information was vague, just that there was a death, and that he needed to go to the police station immediately. The trip to the investigation site was a nightmare for Richard. Every minute seemed like an eternity. He didn't know what to expect, but a growing feeling of dread took over his body. When he arrived at the police station, he found a scene of chaos. Police officers running from one side to the other, journalists crowded together, and a heavy atmosphere that seemed to put pressure on his lungs. The officers asked Richard a few questions about where he was and what he knew about Jessica, but the answers he provided were as vague as the information he had received. Richard explained that he was out of town at a work meeting and was unaware of any recent problems with Jessica. His mind was filled with unanswered questions, and despair was beginning to take over. Meanwhile, Kendra was at home, trying to stay calm. Her heart was still beating fast, but she was determined to maintain her facade of normalcy. The kids were at school, and Richard was still out of town. Kendra prepared dinner as usual, trying to ignore the feeling that something was about to fall apart. She focused on small household tasks, trying to appear like the caring mother and wife she always was. However, the police soon began asking questions in the community. What initially seemed like an isolated case soon turned out to be something more complex. Investigators discovered that Jessica had a history of involvement with Richard, and the case took a new direction. Richard was called to the police station to provide further clarification, and the pressure on him began to increase. He was being viewed as a possible suspect due to his relationship with the victim. Police officers tried to connect all the dots, analyzing accounts from people close to Jessica and Richard. Richard's phone calls were examined, and records showed that he was, in fact, out of town at the time of the murder. However, the suspicion did not disappear. The police noticed something was out of place, and Kendra became a focus of attention. As the investigation progressed, police found evidence that Kendra had visited the park where Jessica was murdered. The parking sign near the trail showed that someone had parked a car that day and time. Although the car wasn't registered to Kendra, the coincidence was enough to raise suspicions. Security cameras from nearby areas were examined, and although the images were unclear, some showed a female figure that resembled Kendra. The next day brought a new wave of tension for the Parker family. Kendra was called in to be questioned by the police. She entered the interrogation room with a calm expression, but inside, she was panicking. The detective received her with a watchful eye and began asking detailed questions about her routine and movements on the day of the murder. Kendra answered the questions with studied calm. She provided an alibi, explaining that she was at home, taking care of the children. However, the questions became increasingly pointed, and Kendra began to feel the pressure. He tried to maintain his composure, but the tension was visible on his face. Police found a pattern of inconsistencies in Kendra's responses, and this only reinforced their suspicions. There were little details that didn't add up, and investigators were beginning to consider the possibility that Kendra was more involved than she initially seemed. At the police station, the atmosphere was increasingly heavy. Richard was being kept under constant surveillance, and detectives were convinced the truth was about to emerge. Meanwhile, Kendra was trapped in a cycle of fear and regret. She knew her life was about to change drastically. The situation was getting more complicated by the minute, and the pressure was affecting his ability to think clearly. The crime, although carefully planned, was beginning to unravel. The investigation was getting closer to the truth, and Kendra knew time was running out. Every decision she made was being monitored, and the reality of her situation was beginning to reveal itself in brutal ways. The investigation was getting closer to unraveling the mystery, and Kendra found herself at the epicenter of chaos that she herself helped create. As the case progressed, the truth about what really happened on the day of Jessica Collins' death was about to come to light, and Kendra needed to face the consequences of her actions. The game of hide and seek was coming to an end, and the cruel reality of the situation was about to crash down on her. The weeks after Jessica Collins' murder were a whirlwind of events. The investigation was progressing quickly, and the case was attracting local media attention. The details of Jessica's life, her relationships with Richard, and the brutal discovery of her body were discussed all over the news. The atmosphere was saturated with speculation and theories, and the pressure on Kendra Parker was increasing every day. Richard, initially a suspect, was relieved of charges when evidence confirmed he was out of town during the crime. However, his relief was temporary. The focus soon turned to Kendra, who, although not initially considered a suspect, was increasingly at the center of the investigation. The fact that she was seen in areas close to the crime scene and the inconsistencies in her responses raised serious questions. The day Kendra was called back to the police station for questioning, the atmosphere was charged with a sense of inevitability. The lead detective, Captain Harrison, knew he was close to solving the case and was determined to pressure Kendra until she confessed. The interrogation began with simple questions, but soon became a session of intense psychological pressure. Kendra entered the interrogation room with the same calm expression she had previously maintained. But now, there was a palpable tension in his movements. She knew she was being squeezed and that her every word could be used against her. Captain Harrison watched her with a penetrating gaze, as if trying to read every thought in her mind. "Let's recap what you did on the day of the murder," began Captain Harrison. "You said you were home with the kids, right?" Kendra nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, that's right. But according to the parking lot evidence and security cameras, you were in the area where Jessica was found. How do you explain that?" Kendra's blood seemed to have frozen. The pressure was building, and she felt the weight of the lies she had told. He tried to maintain control, but his words came out haltingly. "I don't know. Maybe someone saw a car similar to mine. It's not impossible that it was a coincidence." Captain Harrison was not convinced. Coincidences are rare, especially when the person seen looks exactly like you. And the fact that you purchased an item that was found near the crime scene, that's not a coincidence. Kendra felt a wave of despair. The evidence was piling up against her, and the noose was closing. The questions continued, more pointed, unmasking inconsistencies in her story and forcing her to confront the truth. Captain Harrison knew he was close to breaking Kendra's facade. After several hours of interrogation, Kendra could take no more. The evidence and pressure became overwhelming. The reality of his actions and the weight of the consequences began to weigh on his mind. His calm facade began to crack, revealing the despair and guilt that were hidden beneath. Finally, Kendra relented. With a lost look and a shaking voice, she confessed. He told Captain Harrison how he had planned the murder, detailing the moments he followed Jessica and ambushed her in the park. Every word of her confession was a painful blow, both to her and to those who listened. Captain Harrison listened intently, taking notes and making sure every detail was recorded. Kendra's confession brought no relief, only an overwhelming sense of defeat. She knew she was destroyed, and the weight of her own guilt was becoming unbearable. The case was closed with the revelation of her confession, and Kendra's trial quickly began. During the trial, Kendra faced a room full of reporters, Jessica's family, and a community shocked by what had happened. The evidence of his guilt was indisputable. His confession, the evidence found at the crime scene, and the testimonies that confirmed his involvement. The image of Kendra as the wife who became a murderer was a devastating shock to everyone. Kendra's defense tried to argue that her action was motivated by an extreme emotional state and that her sanity was compromised. However, the jury was more focused on the brutal and calculated fact of the crime than the extenuating circumstances. The court found Kendra guilty of murder, and the sentence was handed down. Kendra was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom doors closed behind her, and she was led away to serve her sentence. Kendra Parker's life was irreversibly destroyed. His attempt at revenge, driven by a desire for personal justice, cost him not only his freedom but also his identity. The world as she knew it was falling apart, and the weight of her actions would stay with her for the rest of her life. As Kendra prepared for what came next, Jessica Collins' case became a landmark in the community, remembered as a grim example of how betrayal and obsession can lead to tragic consequences. The lives of those involved were forever marked by this crime, and the impact of the case echoed through the lives of those who were directly affected. The cycle of violence and revenge had finally ended, but the cost was high, and the scars left by this affair would remain visible for many years. Kendra Parker's ending was a heartbreaking reminder that when the line between justice and revenge is crossed, the consequences can be devastating and permanent.